Toxic City. I am not toxic, girl. ¿Estás hablando conmigo? What? You're toxic. Toxic City.
I should have known with the way that her mouth went agape that wasn't something that I should be mentioning in polite grilled cheese conversation. Who told you this, muñeca? She countered, crossing her hands in front of her on the table. Eggy, I'd answer between bites. She mentioned it when we were hanging the sheets. Mrs. Z raised her eyebrows like she was trying to get them to dance on her face. Clearing her throat, she got up from her seat to get herself a glass of water. Turning around to face me, she stood at the sink and clinked her teeth before answering. Listen to me very closely, huh? She exhales, putting her hand out. I shook my eager head yes. If there was truth to tell, Mrs. Z was not going to let me down. She'd give it to me straight. She'd let me know what was up in the big stinking mud comet. I don't, she began, grabbing the bridge of her nose. I am not. Listen, don't date a Puerto Rican, okay? Scrounging my nose, I unleashed an epic expression of concern in her direction. Do what? I managed, more confused than when I started to ask. They are mean, and they don't like candy, and they smell like a distillery. Eat your food. It'll be dinner time before you finish, huh? She hissed, pushing my plate towards me. Eating my crispy grilled cheese, my mind began to wonder what made these ladies have such an opinion. Thoughts swarmed my head like I was struggling to find an air-filled clarity dipped in truth for once. They eat all the candy? Could a person eat that much candy and live to tell the tale? By the end of my grilled cheese, one thing was clear. I would not be sharing my candy with anyone. Feeling more confused than when I began my righteous search for the meaning behind the statement, I wondered if I would ever marry anyone to begin with. I mean, so far I witnessed the exchange between my own egg donors, which were the basis of my relationships this far. Eggy woke up, painted her face, wound her hair in curlers into a curly crown of darkened pin curls before she even began her day of cooking, cleaning, and what she believed to be the essence of a woman. Sometimes she cried when she thought no one was the wiser, but my eyes saw the pain. I personally never saw him hit her. I only saw the crying aftermath that was filled with overturned items and a spilled mess of limited, drying ambition. Over the years, she would fill my mind with small bits of secreted knowledge. I never did find out what muddying your blood meant until I was the age of 27, oddly enough. After being hounded to find and research the bloodline, I was knee-deep in old church registries with Eggy sitting across from me as life came back in to gut-check her in the travesty of a lifetime in her era. The way she used that phrase, it came from her parents. It was a learned perception that was drilled into her mind. Being born in 1932, Eggy had a whole lot of outdated misconceptions that were instilled in who she was forced to be, not necessarily who she was meant to become. Back then, race was a huge issue, especially being that her father was of Spanish descent. Spanish, as in Spaniard. It's not how it sounds. The man appeared to be Caucasian, with the most aqua bluest eyes anyone could ever see for miles. The darkness of your skin was a huge thing for him. I'm not sure why. By the time I was old enough to understand him, he talked so softly and usually remained silent until he had something so profound to say. He too lived a life of scandal. It's not my job to judge. I just find life dripping in irony as I'm the one who is the recent recipient of this poisonous outlook via his egg. I'm profoundly happy to say that those outlooks end with me, though. I've always told my own children that they should be proud of who they are, who they love, and where they come from, as these things tend to make you who you are as a person, but they don't always contribute to who you have yet to become. Circumstances change you, whether you like them or not. Same can be said about enlightenment. Once you gain knowledge on certain situations, you can't just go back to not being the wiser. Knowledge changes perception, outlook, and feelings, just like it did the day that I found the beginning of our bloodline. Flipping through the old church records that started in 1532, I carefully ran my gloved fingers over the records that held many families that began through this church. Part of me was so excited to be staring history directly in the face as I searched for traces of my past. Times were different then. People in the mission during this time in history were forced to marry, convert to Catholicism, and even forced to conceive by violent methods, unfortunately. Eggie often pulled her purse closer to her when she was feeling triggered. Part of me didn't want her to feel personally attacked. The other, more demanding part of me wanted my answer. It's not like I didn't know what her statement meant. Muddying your blood basically means you actively choose to date, marry, or breed with someone of African American or mixed blood descent. It's hateful. It's wrong in my opinion. And this is the exact type of thing that happens in Hispanic families. I want to be clear though. It may not happen in every single Hispanic family, but it is happening. People just refuse to confirm the truth. It's odd. They don't want to be seated with the reputation of the type of people who would say or hold their family to those impossible standards, yet they don't do anything to change the aspect of expectation within themselves. Racism is not acceptable in any form by any individual. Hate is a taught example. It's taught by example. If you set that toxic behavior and drill it into a young person's mind like tradition, why would you expect for that person not to grow up teaching the same nasty expectations to their kin? If we are a product of our raising, at what point does a person say, enough is enough, it ends with me? That is exactly where I drew my line in the sand. I didn't want to pass that same vapid-minded, traditional expectation on to my kids. I want them to be free to love who they love with no expectations, limitations, restrictions, or conditions. Add those things in, that's not love. You love who you love. Gay, straight, bi, black, white, polka-dotted people, if that suits your fancy. After all I've lived through, I was sure about one thing in my life when it came to my kids. I was going to love them as they are, for who they are, as they choose to live and love. It's not my job to tell them who to love. It's not my job to be anything other than their supportive parent. It's my job to not just tell them how to love with an open heart, but to show them as I love them completely to the best of my ability, and then accept them as God sent them to me. This way, they too will pass down that tradition of newly established love to my descendants, and so on. And that is how a legacy is built. Eggie, do you think they loved each other? I asked, carefully flipping through the page. What's love got to do with anything? She countered, taking a deep breath. Looking up at her from the huge registry I held, I could tell the bitterness was swirling to the surface. What do you mean? I breathed, glancing towards a passerby. That's not how it was done in those days. It was a different time. People in the mission were told who they were to marry. Not everyone married for love, you know. she explained, dropping her eyes. Knowing Aggie's history, I knew it was best to tread lightly on such an issue. Okay, I nodded, returning my attention back to the record. It was clear that this whole situation was bothering her spirit as I could see her fidgeting in my peripheral vision. Clearing my throat, I seized the opportunity for an answer to my life's burning question right as I landed on the church record that validated our bloodline. Eggie, why have you always told me not to muddy our blood? I inquired, looking up while pressing my index finger to the entry so I didn't lose my place. Eggie glanced around as if to see who heard my query, crossing her hands on the table, moving her hands in a dusting motion. She ran her aged hand over the surface of the table like she was smoothing out not-so-proud wrinkles in time. Eggie, I pushed. Closing her eyes, she released an exhale that seemed like it stemmed from her soul. Come on, Eggie. I gotta know. I have to know. What's up? Why did you say that? I've always wanted to know. I asked several people throughout my life, and no one can freaking give me a word to say other than what they prefer me not to date. No one ever said why. Be honest. I added, raising my brows. I told you that since you were little. Because I didn't want that for you, she answered, pulling her purse closer to her. At one point or another, you, as a young Hispanic female, will be told who you are expected to date, how you are expected to dress and conduct yourself, if your family is anything like mine. You don't want that for me? I pushed once more. If she was finally talking and explaining everything, I wanted the answers I may never receive again. I don't want people looking at you the way people look at other people who muddy their blood. The way the hair comes out, the baby would have a hard life. People just aren't nice, she explained the best way she could. Eggie wasn't exactly a wordsmith when it came to explaining her reasoning behind her feelings that are usually wrapped up in belief. The problem is, those beliefs she clings to with her old, weathered yet experienced hands are formed with toxic views of a city that no longer exists. It wasn't until that moment where my finger held the place on the family registry that history dealt Eggie a very hard lesson. I had never been so fulfilled in my whole life. Coming from a family who often spoke behind closed doors in very colorful language when it came to folks from a different place than our kin, I had never been so excited to unveil this piece of hidden history. Something in my soul was stirring because her statement had me thinking she knew I was out back making mud pies in my dress, which is a definite no-no for a lady, especially in our family. Moving my hair out of my face, I looked up at her and gathered every courage I had in my 7-year-old body available. Eggie, earlier when you said, not to muddy my blood, what did you mean? I questioned, bracing myself for impact. Eggie never got mad at me. She never raised her voice. She was exceedingly kind and total opposite of the egg donor, which is a whole nother different story made for another book once I've had enough tequila to drown the wounds that would equal an evil travesty that was put in place. Not for this one. Born in 1932, Eggie came from a different time. See, she was a woman who didn't have much education, as she left home early after she jumped into her rooster's car at a sock hop and refused to leave. I'm pretty sure there's more to the story than what they gave me, but from what I was told, her rooster met her at the sock hop, danced with her for exactly 2 dances, and was ready to leave. And as he was leaving, she jumped into his car so he'd agree to drive her home. When he pulled up to the house, her egg donor said that they had to marry because he brought her home. They didn't even know each other, whatsoever. So, in my perspective, Eggie was a whole savage firecracker. If only she knew then what she was getting herself into. What do you mean people aren't nice, Eggy? This is America. People are people. I exhaled, allowing my eyes to memorize my findings. Hi, you know what I mean, she hissed, holding tighter to her purse. Well, I guess you better get used to it then, Eggy, because we with our people now, I countered, placing the book in front of her. Pointing to the entry dated circa 1532, I held my finger there for her to read. Adjusting her glasses, Eggy cleared her throat as her eyes widened when she read the enlightening line. There comes a time in everyone's life that will teach you why it is imperative to never teach hateful things. Whether they choose to admit and accept what God teaches them along the way is up to that person. When the moment arises, we owe it to fate to accept, comprehend the lesson, and then adapt in gratitude. Some take the lessons when it comes. Others refuse and end up doomed to repeat it. Taking a huge deep breath in, Eggy opened her purse and pulled out a cherry lifesaver from her half-eaten pack. Only the Lord knows how long that pack has been in that purse. Like many of her generation, Eggy never wanted to throw anything away. I cringed a tiny fraction, furrowing my brows towards her as I wondered if that stale candy plastic taste was assaulting her taste buds as we sat there. Sad to report, I was not brave enough that day to taste what was left of that lifesaver rainbow. She was just going to have to endure that torture on its own. I waited with eager anticipation for her reaction. As selfish as it sounds, I wanted her response to be one of compassion and understanding. The I told you so part of my heritage wanted to point to the line and let out a various villainous, exaggerated laugh as I jumped on the table in that library, hollering, "See what hate gets you?" But the more rational part of my heart was in control, and she knew she didn't really understand, just as I knew she didn't understand. Sometimes words fall on deaf ears, no matter how much you dress them up. "What does that say?" she whispered, looking left and right before pointing to the book. Shaking my head at her, I let out a small, disapproving sigh as I walked over from my side of the table to hers. "It says that our ancestor, which is listed right here in the registry of the church, is of mestiza blood. This is the church registry from 1532. That right there is the very beginning of our bloodline, Eggy." "This is where we started," I answered, waiting for my words to hit her. "Mestiza?" she queried, running her fingers over the entry. "Well, yeah," I nod. "Mestiza?" "Yes," she fumes, clearing her throat. "Yes," I reiterated, giving her a concerned glance in return. She always disliked when we said yeah. She claimed it showed no home training. "This is the start of our blood," she pulled, flipping the page. "Well, that's what's recorded anyway. I'm sure there's other folks in the line up there. We aren't plants. We didn't just show up through osmosis, Eggy." I smirked, cowering when she smacked my hand. A small, secreted smile escaped her lips as she continued reading. "More than likely, this is probably the branch that came over from the old country with the church. Could be that's why," I added, writing my discovery. I proudly smiled, releasing a small laugh as I cleared up the stack of books. "Why are you laughing?" Eggy asked, following me around the library. Thrusting my fist into the air, I closed my eyes, grabbing my chest proudly. "I'm with my people now. I always knew we had mestiza blood. You can't tell me nothing, Eggy. My blood been muddy since 1500. "Seems to me your people had some explaining to do," I explained, doing a small victory dance. Clutching her purse to her chest, Eggy looked around to see who was watching. She was always so excessively big on what other people thought about our family. I didn't care as much. I was more concerned with the notion that every single person in said bloodline held the same tired, outdated outlook as my library record hunting companion. The child inside, trying to tread water in the sea of righteousness, wanted to poke fun at the rest of our family for maintaining the same brand of dislike, but I kept my party inside. God has a way of getting folks to be more accepting. I figure it's because you just can't saunter into heaven being your hateful self. There's no room for that sort of nonsense up there. You can't party with people you despise for something that's not even in their control. For someone who is raised to know that God is love, and that is how you are to treat one another, she had a few of her own facts ass backward. That is why it is important to address whatever you're at odds with from the jump. Later, you won't have so many things to atone for once your time comes. After in-depth research for a genealogy project, I found out that many of the ancestors we stemmed from were raped by slaves that came over with the Spanish conquistadors. Once the women were dealt with in that regard, they were often forced into marriages by the priests within the missions, as if they were going to settle a score and somehow vindicate their suffering. I'm still a little bit salty about it for my people, the brave ancestors who dared to survive such a time. But since when has history ever been kind to those who have suffered injustices at the hands of another? Given the opportunity to live during a situation like that, I don't think I would have been able to thrive under such conditions myself. But we live in a different world. The newfound information that made my blood-muddying situation rest in an instant had me feeling some kind of way. It didn't make it right, it just didn't settle any wrongs. It clarified why that saying was introduced into the family to begin with. The record we were reading was that of my Eggie's egg donor's egg donor. It wasn't so far removed from where we were as I was third generation. Her mother and father apparently introduced that toxic doctrine into her like it was the 11th commandment. She, in turn, continued the tradition to her own kids, and because I was always with Eggie, she tried to poison the well with me by consuming the intellectual shade branding. As I said before, I made it a point to ensure that this toxic trait ended with me. I didn't want my children boxed in. I didn't want to continue the same toxic, poisonous views that would hinder any aspect of their lives, especially when it comes to dictating who they love or how they love. People love who they love. Love is supposed to be colorblind. It's supposed to be unconditional. It wasn't until many years later, after many healing experiences, that I am able to see where the hate stems from. I see how the outlook was created, and after being enlightened, I see why, in her perception, it was made that way. If experiences are what shape us as human beings, then understanding the experience is up to us in order to grow. I've tried to explain the same notions to Eggie until I was blue in the face. Eventually, I had to surrender to indifference and let that war go. It was not until I caught her trying to fill my children with some of her toxic knowledge that I realized her hate was a chosen outlook. When I confronted her right then about her actions, trying to get her to be accountable for her own hateful outlook, all she replied with was, "I'm too old. You can't be mad at me." Her outlook is outdated and unacceptable, to be honest. It's an outlook that spreads racism, hate, and disloyal traits to new young minds. It's also one I was not willing to entertain by any means. As old as she is now, she'd never be able to understand life as it adapts daily. Her biggest gripe when I was coming up was the consistency of my hair and the thickness of my blood, so to speak. I wasn't surprised a bit when she considered my best friend at the time my girlfriend, as in life partner, not childhood friend. My friend, at the time, did not fit the usual female description her brain sustains. She had tattoos everywhere and had an edge hairstyle that had one side shaved and the rest of her hair being fashioned into a man's type of short haircut. It didn't matter to Eggie that my so-called friend had just cut her hair that way after trying to prove a point to the guy who subsequently left her for his ex-girlfriend, a woman who was bisexual but appeared like a man with the same haircut. After a meltdown, that friend claimed she could do the style better than anyone, so she cut all her hair off in the same way. That hair, paired with the tattoos everywhere and a sheltered outlook, meant that Eggy was once again holding on tight to those hateful beliefs. To this day, she still believes that she was my person. I didn't have the heart to tell her the true reason that the friend was there in the first place, but that's another story for another book. The point of this experience in life is to be very careful of the outlook and perceptions you entertain. If you are afraid to adapt and accept change as it comes to your doorstep, you might find yourself in a muddy, bloodied situation as you are forced to explain your hate to a new generation. Hate takes many forms. It's in tradition. Oftentimes, it's hidden within culture. Deeply seated within people we'd trust our whole lives to. The changes this world desperately needs lies within very capable minds of new generations. There is no room in this world for outdated views. We exist in an evolving world. If we hate as a learned behavior, then it is up to us to change the lessons we are teaching the newer generations. It's time for new traditions, new outlooks, and new perceptions. If your words are thoughts that can enact change that is brought about from your actions, would it not be worth the effort to make a world that all people, races, creeds, ethnicities, genders, and the like can thrive in? So yes, we are the problem. Thank God we're also the solution. What we allow to recycle will grow new disregard for normal decency. Before you teach your eggs the traditions of old, reflect and remember to add a large dose of who you are, why you are, and how you became to be who you are in that lesson, so that they too can learn to walk the path your steps built. It's now your legacy that requires your outlook, your perception, and your determination to leave this place better than when you found it. Before you beg and pray as you watch the news unfold the world we are existing in, don't just sit and holler, "Fix it, Jesus." Take accountability and remember, friend, change begins with you. While there are many species of old trees, the seeds you stem from can vary generation to generation. That is why it is imperative to know where you come from before you make premeditated judgments.
What? Yeah, you're still toxic, girl. Oyes, bueno, bye. Alright, make good choices. Peace. Blue Hoodie Productions.